Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which I think from now on, the rest of this presentation we'll just call CMMC, as I think it's pretty well known. Really looking forward to kind of getting through this. Our real goals today are to make sure that we deliver value to you guys in the audience. So we're going to go through it. Our goal today to go through at a high level what it is and really bring value to you, as I said. So our goal is going to be to get through this hopefully by 12:40, 12:45. And leave about 15 minutes for Q&A. Looking at the poll, we got a very interesting split. About 40% already started on their CMMC journey. A little bit higher than I would have expected, but that's really, really great. About a quarter interested in getting started, and the rest kind of auditing to see if this is up their alley. So a good cross-section, and I think that'll do well, Sammy, with what we put together. So let's get rolling. First thing, let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Ari Santiago, President, CEO of IT Direct, also the host of the Made in America podcast. As the CEO of IT Direct, you can see on the screen, we've been doing and helping manufacturers and companies in Connecticut find ways to leverage and securely leverage technology to meet their business goals for quite some time. Something I've been passionate about, not only because it's something I'm interested in, but because technology and information technology in particular and the ability to do business with it has had a huge impact on my personal life. So something I've been a long time passionate about. And the Made in America podcast, another labor of love that's really helped to raise awareness for manufacturing, and a secondary goal of helping share information and best practices and helping us all kind of rise to new heights. And this webinar fits right in with that. So that's me a bit. Sammy, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Sammy DeLao. I'm the quality manager here at IT Direct, and as you can see on the screen, I've been in IT most of my adult life. It says 20 years in IT, but Ari, I started working in IT since I was 15. So I've always been around IT since even further than 20 years. But one of the things that I kind of learned and grew over the years is seeing technology grow, seeing become a requirement in businesses, and seeing how new technologies are coming out. Over the years as an engineer, network engineer, seeing the new types of network technologies and seeing how new security measures are being put into play. I could see two things. One, technology is defragmenting. We have a lot of solutions, a lot of vendors. So the need for standardization and having frameworks that can guide businesses and people to implement best practices on security. So that's where I really got the passion for compliance and quality. Seeing that you can follow a framework and help people to not only continue to grow their businesses and use technology to reach their business goals, but also making sure that they're keeping their staff informed and trained, implementing security, and following frameworks that is going to deliver a quality service back to their businesses. This area of quality and compliance really piqued my interest, and so a lot of people always say they don't understand why I love quality so much, but here we are. CMMC framework, what we're going to be talking about today, is definitely one of those things where not only is it a requirement, but does provide a lot of value, and it's something that I really feel passionate about.
Listen, speaking as a business owner myself, super happy to have people like you out there, Sammy, because it's really important to have that attention, detail, passion for you have. It's pretty awesome. So let me kind of get into what we're going to cover today at a high level. First, we're going to go through why CMMC, why should someone care about it, what does it mean for them, for their business, the why, super important. Getting into the what, and we'll spend a bit of time on this. What is CMMC exactly? Getting into step 3, how to become compliant. The big question a lot of people want to know, what does it cost? Even bigger question, what's my return on that investment of that cost? We'll wrap it all up and then head into Q&A. So pretty good agenda, I think as Gail alluded to, and we'll get right into it. So let's go why CMMC. And I think a lot of us on the call today, judging by the attendees, know that the CMMC is a DoD defense contracting flowdown. That's going to be important if we want to be executing in the DoD supply base. And starting this year and every year going forward, more and more contracts until eventually, they're all going to require a CMMC level certification. So that's certainly part of it, and I think that was out there. But Sammy, there's a good opportunity right now to talk about what are some of the other reasons, besides just protecting your DoD contracts and growing that revenue, that you might want to consider CMMC compliance?
Well, when you look at the information that we have on the screen here, you can jump to the conclusion that bad cybersecurity equals bad business. In this day of age where we see these threats continually increasing and getting more complex, we're seeing the effects on the business side. The hits that companies are taking, which is loss of productivity. Also, the hard costs around cleanup. These are the areas where we've seen businesses taking a hit. And so the numbers here are showing that not only are we seeing this year after year, it's actually increasing. So the risk is going to be greater. So the need to implement cybersecurity best practices is critical to a business. And so something like CMMC framework will give us the guidelines necessary to implement these best practices and to address these threats. Like you can see on the right on the screen here, a lot of the threats that we're seeing today, a lot of them have to do with simple email phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, accounts getting compromised, or even something as simple as losing a piece of equipment like a laptop, which may lead into a much bigger breach. So these are the reasons why it's important to look into a cybersecurity framework to implement in your business, and not just because you want to just check off a box in your requirement list.
There's no question about that. And I think, you and I have been living through it. We've gotten how many calls already this year from people that we didn't know before calling to say, hey, my network's been breached. We've had people that have transferred or lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars due to, sophisticated phishing attacks. We've dealt with, multiple companies that have been brought to their knees, by people coming in and implementing highly sophisticated ransomware. And it's really just been growing. I think, some people look at these numbers and say, $3 million, $8 million, those are huge numbers. But, you and I have dealt with this year alone, small companies, 50, 60 employees who've been, held for $150,000 ransom, not just to decrypt their data, but if they didn't want to have their customers contacted and show that they were able to steal their information. So absolutely, like you said, I think it really comes down to bad cybersecurity practices is just bad business. So I think it's important, right? We talked about a lot about the why. So let's get into the what of CMMC. And I know this is a big part of the meat of what we wanted to talk about today. So what is CMMC, Sammy? What is it? What are these 17 domains? What are the 5 maturity levels? Give us the kind of the what on this thing.
Well, to start, if you look at the right, the actual model with the 5 levels, to give you a quick idea or a quick context of what this framework's all about, many of the attendants here may already heard of NIST 800-171. And for those that have already done their NIST 800-171 audit, you're already halfway through the CMMC framework auditing. Because the framework itself for CMMC is based on NIST 800-171. And then there's some additional controls that have been added to address some of the new things we've learned over the last few years, those lessons learned about how people have implemented their controls and cybersecurity best practices, and some of the incidents that people have had experience. So based on this, maturity model was developed to show that growth of cybersecurity implementation in your environment. So it's kind of like a video game. There's 5 levels. Obviously, you want to get to the end, the top level, but in the meantime, you got to beat each level, right? And this is what we're seeing here. We have level 1 and 2, which are just basically basic and intermediate cyber hygiene. This is what we could call the best practice controls. For some of the people on the webinar, you may remember the DFARS clauses, and there was like the 17 controls that every company should have, and those were considered best practices like antivirus, good backups, good access control, physical security. Those were things that any business should have in the environment, and those controls would fall under the level 1, level 2. Once you reach level 3, that's where all the NIST 800-171 controls really come together. So you'll see the 110 controls you saw in NIST 800-171, plus an additional 20 controls to further enhance your cybersecurity best practice. So we're going to be talking a lot about level 3 because that's going to be the baseline that most companies are going to be looking for when they're looking at getting CMMC certified.
So just thinking about the relationship between NIST 800-171, which I think is probably familiar to many people. I mean, by the rules, right? Everybody who had CUI, controlled unclassified information, who was in that DoD supply chain, was already supposed to be NIST 800-171 compliant by December 31st, 2017. So where does, if I think I'm NIST 800-171 compliant, where does that put me on the CMMC maturity model, right? So if I'm looking at that right side of the screen here, and I love that video game analogy, right? So if I'm trying to beat those levels, if I think I'm NIST 800 171, am I already at level 3 then? Have I already jumped to that level?
Well, you're definitely in the space of level 3. So the next step would be to measure yourself against the updated controls. So a lot of the language has been updated. So you'll see a lot of similar things, but more clarifications. Plus, as I mentioned, there's additional controls that you want to make sure that you're also meeting those things. So if you had the original requirement of NIST 800 171, you're looking at CMMC level 3.
Right. So what's the difference between level 1? Looks like talking about the video games, right? Each level builds upon each other level. So does that mean everyone starts at level 1? Kind of talk me through that process a little bit.
Correct. So you got to work your way up. So if you're at level 3 or you're looking at getting level 3 certified, it's expected that you're also going to meet the level 1 and level 2 requirements. So the breakdown really is at level 1 and level 2, like I mentioned before, best practice controls and cybersecurity best practice. Once you get to level 3, it really focuses more on the controls around CUI or control and classified information. At that point, you're going to enhance your policies, procedures, and controls to focus more on the security around that particular type of data.
So what's some of the differences, looking at, CMMC versus NIST specifically, like what are some of the differences? Are they just like 30 more items they decided we need to do, or what's the differences?
Well, as the name shows, I really like that it's a maturity model, so showing growth. So we're growing into a model that is expected to get more better as time goes on, as you continue to implement. And as you notice the image on the right, it breaks it down to 2 different sections, the left side talking about processes, the right side talking about practices. So when you were looking at NIST 800 171 and the controls, it would just show you what they were expecting you to do. With CMMC, not only is it expecting you to have the controls in place, which would be your practices, you also want to make sure that you have the policies and procedures to manage, monitor, and to continually update and review these controls. So it's expanding not only up, but sideways, and it's showing that you're having a good practice of not only implementing and enforcing, but also maintaining these controls.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've often thought about NIST 800 was that that it didn't give you, it was a little bit complicated, hard to, I didn't always understand what was written in there. The CMMC add to that complexity, take away from it? What do you see in that regard?
I feel like it actually, they took the lessons and experiences from people that went through the NIST 800 171 audit. So they did a really good job in the lead up to this to review it, to take these lessons learned and implement it into this. So a lot of the language is now a lot more clear. I know, just to throw one idea out there, a lot of people had a confusion around what needed to be encrypted. It was very confused when it talked about FIPS validated or certified, but now it's very clear that they're making sure that the algorithms used for encryption are certified, not necessarily the tools that are using these encryption types. So a lot of the language is a lot more clear to help you to know how to close these gaps in your environments. And they've really made these enhancements in the 17 domains that we have on the left side of the screen here. And these domains are going to be very familiar to the people that have done this 800 171, because 14 of those are the 14 control groups that you'll see in this 800 171, but they've also added 3 more to show that enhancement and maturity in this model. Just to kind of highlight a couple of those, the recovery domain is a really key one. In the past, in NIST 800 171, backup and recovery was a requirement as part of the maintenance, media protection, and a couple other controls. But now, from the past experience, we learned that people can have backups. Doesn't mean they always work. And unfortunately, we've had situations where we need the backup and it's not working. So now the recovery domain is focusing on not only making sure that the backups are running, but are we sure that they're working, that they're resilient, meaning that they're available, and we have second layers of backups in case of a situation.
Yeah, that's a huge one. From our own experience, you and I've seen time and time again where the call comes in and says something along the lines of, we had a problem, here we can't access this, or our network is down. And then the question goes, okay, well, what's the status of your backups? and then there's some combination of either they were deleted, they were encrypted, or we discovered that half the server backups hadn't run in 3 months. That's like, having all the best security in the world, but if you leave your door unlocked, that's a problem. What are some of the other domain changes, Sammy, that are important here that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, another of the new ones, situational awareness. It's a really new one, so people are trying to kind of wrap their head around that. But it really puts you to the task of understanding your own risk to your business and how you conduct business. So take into account your environment, your staff, the size of the company, the complexity of the environment, and then identifying risks that you need to be aware of so you can maintain your team up to date on these risks, that you can implement controls such as training and security measures to kind of mitigate those risks, and then to continually review these things regularly so that you're making sure that you're protecting yourself and being more proactive instead of reactive, which we've seen in the past with the NIST 800-171, seems to be a little bit more reactive in that area.
So when we're, not to kind of jump back to the maturity models and the different levels, but I am going to do that now. So when we think about like level 1, level 2, level 3, you said level 3 CUI focused. So do you have a sense from what we know so far, understanding that, it's still kind of newish, and they're releasing updates, do you have a sense of like where the target level of CMMC is going to be to start? Like, should people be thinking, I just got to get to 2? Should they be targeting 5? Like, what should people be thinking about in terms of where they want to go on their CMMC journey?
Yeah, definitely. So if the requirement, or if you're handling CUI data, you're going to want to start at level 3. The nice thing about the controls too is it's very easy to identify the controls that are revolving around CUI data. And I know a lot of times people have a hard time understanding what data is considered CUI data. Some are a little bit more obvious. Like if you have a drawing or schematic of the Patriot missile, that's going to be CUI data. But understanding that there's some that are not as obvious, like making sure that any system that is keeping track of part numbers within that same CUI workflow. So one of the requirements that's included now in CMMC is having a documented CUI workflow doc. So you're showing that you understand where the data sits, how it's being manipulated, what are the controls in place to manage and contain that information. So if you have those needs and requirements, we're definitely going to start in level 3. And the goal is over time, as you continue to maintain these controls, you're going to mature into level 4 and level 5.
You think that's just going to be a natural outflow of being CMMC level 3 compliant? You think over time it's just going to push you into those higher levels?
It definitely, that is the goal of this maturity model, because you want to continue growing up, let's call it. So we want to continue to mature, but also what we're going to see from the contract side, they may all start at level 3, but over time, they're going to require you to move up in these levels.
Do you expect or anticipate there'll be any contracts that'll come out that will be level 1, level 2?
That could very well be the case. Like I said before, level 1, level 2 is just like good best practice. So if there may be contracts there that the process may not even need CUI handling or manipulation, if that's the case, this is still a good best practice. And one of the topics that we keep talking about in conversations with you, Ari, and with other clients is that in either case, this is just a great model to follow for businesses, whether we're handling DoD contracts or CUI data.
Yeah, so before we kind of move on to the next thing, which is sort of the how do we get compliant, and let's just touch a little bit on that, which is, if you don't need CUI, something you and I have talked about a lot, which is having a model, and you're kind of focused on quality, having a model or a framework to work in allows us to measure ourselves against something and have a framework within which to work, which is how we can measure quality and consistency. And we all know that can drive a lot of value. So if I don't have CUI, but I'm still thinking I'd like a framework, where does CMMC fit into my mindset there, do you think?
The one thing I could say to that is there's a lot of frameworks out there that we could use or follow. I really have been enjoying the language in this one because it's easier to understand and to follow. So, we have ISO 27001 and 2. We have NIST 853-171. There's a lot of frameworks out there that we could be following. But the guidelines and the way this one is structured, level 1, level 2 could be a framework we could use for any type of audit or gap assessment that a business may need. And especially if you've run into an incident where you need follow-ups and a lot of cybersecurity insurance policy will require you to do so after the fact. Following the CMMC Level 2 framework may be the best one to use to measure gaps and risk in your environment.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. That's, I think, kind of clears up a lot of that what the CMMC is. So let's move on to the next idea of like how. So all right, so CMMC makes some sense. Maybe I'm in the DoD supply chain. I'm already kind of NIST 800 171. So if I'm falling into that CUI, I know I'm going to have to go CMMC. If I just want good cyber hygiene, maybe it makes sense to do it. So let's talk about it. How do I do it, Sam? How do I get there?
First thing is to start a gap assessment. We need to identify what's our compliance status. What percentage of the full level 3 compliance how close are we to 100% compliance? So running the gap assessment would measure against each one of these controls. At level 3, we're talking about 130 different controls that we need to measure against across those 17 domains. So going through that, reviewing it is a very labor-intense work, because not only do you need to review the environment, the physical security, you also need to talk to the subject matter experts that understand the workflows of a lot of CUI data to understand what systems are they using, where is data being kept and saved in hard copies and printouts on the server, in the cloud, how is it being transmitted? Is it being transmitted by email, by FTP? Understanding all those workflows, because all that's going to have to get documented. And as you go through those controls, you're going to identify, well, here's the gap right here. We don't have a control for this, or we're partially compliant here. We may need a policy doc to kind of enhance this control. So going through that exercise and kind of attaching a little bit of risk assessment to kind of measure the risk there, because a lot of times it's not going to be black and white. A lot of times you're going to find a gap, and you need to understand the risk involved in this to the business, so you could say, what do we need to do in order to mitigate that risk? Once you complete the gap assessment, you go to the next phase, which is the remediation. You have a list of gaps that you'll need to remediate, and then you'll start creating the plan to complete that.
So, I mean, what is that? So if I'm going through a gap assessment and I want to do that, you're saying, what, it's going to involve looking at systems, a physical plant review, domain expert interviews, understanding CUI workflow. Do I have to do a data classification matrix? Is that a requirement? Something we should consider doing, unrelated?
No, definitely. There's several controls that require you to identify and tag where CUI data is. So whether it's on a share on a server, understanding how are we controlling access, who has access to it. If we're transporting it with removable media, being able to tag those sort of things. So there is a lot more involved, and the data classification is going to be an important part. So, and not only is it good for CUI, but as the gap assessment practice, it's always good to throw in everything else in there. What's finance data? What's HR data? Go through that same exercise so you get that value that you're going through just for CUI, but put it for the rest of your environment and document it.
So the gap assessment goes beyond just sort of CUI. If my ERP is in the cloud or my email is in the cloud, do I even need to do a gap assessment? Can I just be like, oh no, it's in the cloud, they've taken care of it?
You still need to do a gap assessment, and obviously there's different measures in place on how you handle vendors, subcontractors, and third-party vendors. So you still need to go through that process. And a lot of times they may also do their due diligence, which is really good, makes our job a little bit easier. But we still need to go through that process. And at a minimum, make sure that our policies reflect that we're verifying with our vendors that they are following these guidelines and framework.
So so I get through my gap assessment, and I end up with what, I should have like a report that sort of ties back all the individual 130 controls and identifies where my CUI is, what I should be securing, and then how I'm actually meeting each of the domains on the individual things that need to secure, right? That's what I'm getting back with my gap assessment?
Definitely. It identifies the controls, but a lot of times the remediation solution may cover several controls. So part of this gap assessment and working with a vendor that can help you out with this process is to help you see how multiple controls correlates to one solution to make your workflow a lot more efficient. And being able to document things the same way so that you're not doing one control at a time, but putting in solutions that are going to meet your business needs and your budget.
Sounds like, I'm fond of saying, these remediation plans are one part science, one part art. Sounds like
Right.
that definitely holds true. So, as you're thinking about remediation, and let's say that I've got my gap assessment already, some of the people have already started the process, so maybe they've got their gap assessment. Is there a one-size-fits-all from a remediation standpoint?
Not at all. Every business is different, and two businesses are not alike. The employees, the technology, the staff, the work that they're being produced, everything's a little bit different. So there are going to be some areas where the solutions are pretty straightforward. If you need MFA, you need MFA. If you need an encrypted VPN connection, that's what you're going to need. But a lot of the ways to mitigate the risk and the gaps are going to be tailored to the needs of the business. And that requires, like you said, it's a part science, part art. It's going to require someone that knows to work with those controls and being able to write up those policies to describe exactly how you're addressing those gaps and risks.
So we got the gap assessment, we've come up with a remediation plan. Obviously, we then got to implement that. Talk about the audit portion, the audit step of this process.
So the way that the CMMC process has been built out is they're actually going to be using third-party organizations to do the auditing. So you're going to hear, we're throwing in another acronym into the mix. We got CMMC, now we have C3PAO. And I'm saying it slowly because I always say C3PO by accident. But this stands for Certified Third-Party Assessment Organization. So right now we're currently waiting on the process to begin for these third-party organizations to be certified to do the audits. So once they start getting certified and they're ready to audit, these third-party vendors will be able to come in and do the audits for you, with the delivery, at the end, delivering your certificate, which will be good for 3 years.
So, I mean, that's a big change, right, from NIST 800-171, which essentially was a self-certification. You just say, I'm compliant, and basically, you could essentially say you were compliant. Now we're going to need, these C3PAOs, the alphabet soup grows, the C3PAO to come in and give you that certification. So, Sammy, do we have a sense now of what's going to happen if you think you're done, you bring in the C3PAO and they don't pass you right away? Does that mean that you're out? You have a chance to remediate and get recertified? How does that work?
That still hasn't been cleared up, but if it's following the standard model of auditing, and many have, if they gone through the process, they understand that after an audit, you may get a list of things that you still need to remediate, and given a period of time in order to address them. So that's what we're expecting right now. We're just waiting on confirmation on that.
That's great. One of the nice parts about the certification is that it's going to put everybody on the same playing field, right? It can be frustrating to spend the time, energy, and effort to get NIST 800 compliant and then have other people say that they are who haven't actually done it. So even that playing field is kind of a nice thing. So look, I mean, probably on everybody's mind, okay, so now we know the why, we know the what, we know the how. What's it going to cost, man?
Yeah. So like we mentioned before, every business is different. So it's not as simple as looking out the window and seeing what the gas price is today. It's going to be adjusted to the needs of every environment. So the gap assessment, the cost behind that will depend on the complexity and the size of the environments. One factor that that came in mind right before the meeting too, and I think we talked about it before, Ari, is for those that have already gone through the NIST 800-171, you're ahead of the game there, because now you're doing is going back, reviewing what you already put in place, and then just kind of making sure that it aligns itself up with the CMMC Level 3 controls. But the gap assessments, on average, I've seen it go anywhere between $10,000 to $30,000 for an engagement. Obviously, it could be a little less or it could be a little more depending on the complexity of the environment. So that's the first one-off cost. And then from there, it's those system upgrades and remediation plans. And one thing to note about this is, for those that have gone through NIST 800-171, one of the ways that we could say that we were compliant by saying we were working on things, that we would create these POAMs or POEMs, the plan of action and milestone documents. Those are not going to fly now with CMMC. You either are compliant or you're not compliant. So we need to make sure that once we get those remediation plans in place, we start working on that to be ready for the audit and certification.
Well, the good news on the one-off cost, right, is if I've already gone through the NIST 800-171, probably my gap assessment will be a little bit easier if I've got a good gap that I already closed. And even if that gap assessment, once the gap assessment is done, hopefully I'm going to have less system upgrades and less remediation to do. So that's nice. So I'll have to close some gaps right on those additional 30 controls, but to get it there. So that's sort of one-off cost, and that I think made sense to me. Let's talk about the ongoing expenses. What are we looking at there? Are these ongoing expenses different in addition to NIST 800, 171, same? Like, talk about that a little bit.
It's a little bit of both, Ari. Some of them are the same, and some of them are just added on to enhance a little bit better. The one interesting thing about the ongoing expenses that we have here is, again, showing that maturity in our cybersecurity best practice. One of the things that we need to make sure of is not only do we implement a solution or a control in place, that we're managing it, we're monitoring it, and we're updating it as needed. And that's why we'll see some of these costs that are going to be regular moving forward. So if you look at that list, network and email security, hey, make sure that your firewall has support, that you have the subscription for AV filtering, content filtering, DPI, other firewall content monitoring, those types of services, having those in place. For email security, paying for spam services, email encryption services. If you have mobile devices that have email used for transporting CUI data, and making sure you have a mobile device management system in place, which is an ongoing cost. One of the bigger ones on the list here that you're seeing everywhere now is that multi-factor authentication solution. Putting it everywhere where you're connecting into your environment, whether it's VPN, accessing a website, or also the administrative access for people that have privileged rights to servers. So adding that second layer authentication is key. A more robust cybersecurity training program to help train your staff so that they're better prepared to identify these threats and avoid these risks. And then just enhancing on things like logging, policies, and risk and security assessments, which were part of the NIST 800, 171, but tend to be the ones that fall off at the end. So you could do logging and collect it, but we need to make sure someone's looking at it and correlating it to an activity that needs attention. And then making sure that you have your policies.
As an IT professional, man, it just feels like we got logs coming out the wazoo. You know what I mean? So some better way to kind of monitor that, because who's gonna get through that? And I just want to circle back one thing on that multi-factor authentication, because what's funny is, as we look at these, Sammy, you and I talked about this offline, is a lot of this stuff is just best practices that we've been implementing over time because we see the harm that's being done by not doing that. And I think of the multi-factor authentication, which a lot of us have been familiar with through text, codes from our bank or our credit card logins, and remote access, but moving that to the point you just made about actually adding multi-factor authentication, not just for connection tools, but also for administrative access, anyone that has those elevated rights. And, we kind of were sharing stories that we've seen recently of people that have had, breaches where they get the username of password of someone who doesn't have elevated rights, but because every computer in your network caches local credentials, they can dump that local database using some sophisticated techniques, but not hard to find, and get local admin accounts or domain admin accounts that have logged into those computers, and then leverage those to go through the network and attack systems, both cloud and local systems, and we've seen that. So I think, these are really important tools, that are really best practices, not just for CUI, but just to keep your business operating. So I think that's really important. So, and I apologize. I know I interrupted you in one of your highlights, robust policies and procedures. Certainly something that you're really good at. So I'll let you get back to that.
No, definitely. People at the office know that I love documenting everything. So that's one of my, fun things to do at the end of the day. But, in all seriousness, it's important to have those policies in place. But now we're showing this maturity. We need to make sure that we're staying on top of it, of enforcing it. And part of that is also the risk and security assessments, doing this regularly to make sure that not only are we enforcing it, the controls are being maintained. Do we need to make adjustments? Did something change in our business that needs to get addressed now? These are the practices that we need to do regularly in order to keep this certification. And remember, you're going to have to do this every 3 years. So you need to make sure that you're staying on top of it. And if you plan on moving up those levels to level 4 and level 5, we need to make sure that we keep and stay at level 3 at all times.
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing that you brought up there. One of the things that, we've talked about between us is that, NIST 800-171 in some senses felt very focused on getting to a something. But what we've seen just living in the IT world is cybersecurity isn't a destination. It's a consistent practice and journey. And as much as, we may or may not like, you enjoy, I not as much, writing these policies and procedures, what's really important is doing it in a way that's meaningful and usable, so that those policies and procedures stay fresh, so that we're staying secure. We don't get secure, we stay secure. And I think that's super important. So let's kind of flip. We sort of talked about some of these costs. Some are one time and a bunch of ongoing costs here. So let's get into the return on the investment here, the ROI, which, near and dear to my heart as a business owner myself, is like, okay, we're going to spend and invest this money, and we've done it here ourselves. So where are we going to get the ROI? And I think, true to anything with security, ROI has two components, right? One is defensive, and hopefully there's some offensive as well. So let's just touch on the defensive a little bit. In the beginning, rather talk about the offensive. So in the beginning, Connecticut 2018 got about $14 billion in defense contracts, through the state of Connecticut, which is a small portion, not even 10% of overall DoD contracts. So there's a lot of DoD flow down and spend that's out for the taking. Clearly, Connecticut's got great exposure through submarine building, jet engines, other defense contracts, helicopters, different aerospace stuff, space, other military programs, they're here in Connecticut, and certainly we've got room to grow in that. And if we're going to grow in that and be competitive, we're going to need to be CMC compliant. And one of the things we've heard and seen through our relationships in manufacturing, as well as through the Made in America podcast, is that one of the silver linings, or one of the upsides some people we've talked to have found in this COVID crisis, is that not everyone took the time to be prepared and keep their operations growing. And we know that opportunities have arisen from suppliers who weren't able to meet needs of their customers, and their customers who, were able to go to another supplier. And Connecticut businesses have won new agreements through people's inability to deliver. And we'd hate to see that reverse itself with CMMC. And rather, if we could get ahead of the trend and be more compliant, we can be in a position to win it, because the DoD has said, and we know this through the CMMC trainings that we've done, that if you win an award and you can't produce your CMMC certificate, they're going to go to the next bidder that can. And so it's going to be important from an offensive perspective to have that CMMC compliance. And I know a lot of people in Connecticut aren't prime vendors to DoD, might be kind of in the flow down, but being able to go and say, hey, listen, we're not going to slow you down. We've got the compliance. You'll be able to have that in your back pocket. Could be a great offensive weapon, and maybe an opportunity to get some more of that work that we don't already have. So, kind of dovetailing off of that, and really kind of going back, Sammy, what you said, there's been a lot of breaches in the U.S., and those breaches cost money. And maybe you could spend a little bit of time talking about what you've seen from the impact on costs to customers we know about that have been breached.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you have the data there that the average cost of data breaches is around $8 million. Yeah, it may seem a little bit high, but when you're thinking about the stopping production, losing days or even weeks of business, it could take a big hit. And also the costs around cleanup and following up. And then there's always going to be further follow-ups there with further audits and forcefully going through the gap assessment process after an incident. So the cost is there. And the other main factor is seeing that over the years, the threat is just increasing. So more and more, we're going to be seeing more new attempts, new ways to get into these environments. So more than ever, we need to fortify our defenses now, so that we're prepared to handle the stuff that we don't even know is going to be coming in the next 6 year, 2, 3, 5 years. One of the interesting statistics I heard recently, and not necessarily just manufacturing and CMMC, but from the healthcare perspective, they were saying by 2030, everyone in the United States would have one part of their personal healthcare information exposed through data breaches. And that's trending to that point because you hear these incidents happening day after day. So the threat is real and it keeps growing. So this is really important, not seeing it as just a requirement, but seeing it as a good practice for your business. Implementing these cybersecurity measures that will obviously return on investment to your business.
Yeah, 100%. And before we kind of get to the last bullet point, which I think is a really interesting one, just to say what you and I have seen, that the amounts of dollars companies that are getting ransomed, for instance, that seem to go up. We remember 5 or 6 years ago, you could get ransomed for $500, $600, $1,000. 3 years ago, 15, 25, 50,000. We know of a company recently with under 70 employees that got a ransom for $150,000. So it's just those numbers are going up, and it just drives more investment on the bad guys' end to get in. So it's a real challenge, and we need to be secure to help kind of stem that tide. And the last piece is a really important one, maybe something we should have even led with in hindsight, which is that CMMC compliance costs are considered allowable and reimbursable through the DoD contracts. And so the details on that, we're certainly not federal contracting experts. That's not our area, but the details on that from what we've seen through our CMMC trainings aren't 100% clear, but it certainly seems that getting in there and being able to claim some of these ongoing costs and costs related to CMMC compliance can be built into some contracting. We know we're working with a company right now who's talking about doing that with their direct contracts. So we know it's possible and being worked on. So the government's not only saying it's a good idea, but they're also willing to put some money behind it as well. So listen, at the end of the day, if we get breached or we have a cybersecurity problem, we're going to get stuck doing this stuff anyway and have all the pain. So if we can just do it first and avoid the pain, we'll be better off. So let's wrap it all up before we get into Q&A, and running 2 minutes behind Sammy, so I'll try and put it together. Listen, these are the important dates. CMMC is relatively new. We can see that it's changing. We expect another revision, Sammy, coming out, September, you said?
Yeah, by the end of the summer.
And also,
some of the other clauses like DFARS will be updated at that point.
Yeah, so and that's the thing, right? We're still seeing updates in NIST 800-171 and DFARS, which is all kind of coming into the CMMC overall framework. We do know that starting in October, they're going to release the first 10 RFPs with, I think, 1,500 contracts or something that will also have CMMC compliance requirements. So this is real, happening now. And as the contracts renew over the next 5 years, they're all going to have CMMC compliance requirements. That's why it's going to take all that time, not because not all of the contracts are going to have it, but because there's a 5-year cycle on a lot of this procurement. And so as they renew, they're going to build this requirement in there. And then on the right-hand side, we just quickly said timeline to get compliant. It certainly varies widely. The gap assessments generally are a 4 to 8 week process to get that gap assessment done. But then, of course, the compliance beyond that, the remediation is going to depend greatly on where you stand on that. So I think there's some important dates and some important timelines. And so looking at the 12 minutes left and trying to respect the time, let's go to Q&A. So really quickly, we've got our contact information is on the right. I'm at the top. See my email. LinkedIn's a great way to engage with me, and also we put a lot of content on LinkedIn, continuing engagement and education, CMMC information, and so forth. So please, feel free to get that. And I've also got my SMS text number. So if you prefer to send some text, you can hit me up on the text right there, and that's on there, and Sammy's information below. So let's open it up to questions throughout the thing. Well, we got one nice comment on my mug, so I certainly appreciate that. Got a question, Sammy, about, can you explain the relationship between FIPS certification and CMMC? You touched on it before, I think. I don't know if they missed it, but maybe you could just quickly touch on FIPS certification and CMMC.
Yeah, that's a question that comes up a lot, because especially with the way NIST 800-171 was written, a lot of people were wondering, does an entire system need to be FIPS validated, or what's the requirement there? CMMC makes it clear. It says if your system is using encryption, the encryption algorithm has to be FIPS validated encryption. So that makes it a lot easier to understand, because the product itself doesn't have to be FIPS validated, but the encryption type it's using does. So it has to be a known approved encryption type, and that makes it a lot more clear for people to understand if their systems are compliant or not. At the same time, for people that are managing websites, as an example, they need to make sure if they're running any custom code, that if they're encrypting anything through custom code, that's where I would really start looking into. If you're not using a validated encryption type, then we would have to take that into consideration.
And just as I mean, there's some techie people on this webinar. So when you say like FIPS certified encryption types, we're talking about basic stuff, right? So it's the AES, the AES encryption, right? It's WPA2 encryption, stuff that we all know and use. Just saying that I don't have to worry about getting my specific switch or my specific firewall. It doesn't have to go on through the FIPS validation. It's just the tools that it's using has to be FIPS validated encryption, which is all the mainstream stuff, right?
Yeah, that is correct. And there's other areas that we have to take into account. A lot of times the system is capable of that, but sometimes they're not using that level. They might be using a more lower level of encryption. We need to make sure those are disabled, making sure your certificates that you're using are at the level they need to be, TLS 1.2, SHA-256, that sort of thing.
Another question, Sammy. Are you saying all of my data needs to be encrypted? I don't think that's what we're saying, but why don't you? I'll let you take that.
Everyone always asks this question too, because the question is, how can I encrypt my data at rest? So the controls around how you protect COI data is very clear as well there. They specify clearly that COI data in transit needs to be encrypted. So if you're accessing through VPN, VPN needs to be encrypted. If you're sending data, COI data through email, encrypt the email. But when it's data at rest, we need to make sure that controls are in place to limit access to it. And that's what the control really says. So one way to do it is encryption, definitely, but other ways of mitigating risk for access is making sure you have specific controls around who can access it, that you have logging so you can see who's accessing and what they're doing with. And having those controls in place are ways that you can mitigate the risk and show that you're compliant.
So I got one more in here, which just says, does this really mean the end of Windows 7? I'll just take that. I got another one just popped in too, but I'll take that one, which is Windows 7 already died. So if you're still using it, it's a posthumous usage of Windows 7. But it does, on a serious note, it means that from a general use perspective, Windows 7, along with Windows XP, Windows 2000, God forbid Windows NT, absolutely, really won't be able to be used in those environments. However, and this is, I think, the big however, that there are often systems where they're CNC machines or other manufacturing level machines that either have a built-in or nearly built-in control set that uses an old operating system. And there are mitigation techniques that we can use because obviously getting rid of those could be very problematic. So that could be a problem, but those are mitigatable. But from a general use perspective, meaning desktops, laptops, VDIs, any of that stuff, yeah, Windows 7 RIP, it's gone. Let's see, we got another one in here. It says, do we offer multi-day classes to train on CMMC NIST? Been through a gap analysis remediation. While this is all good, it would be helpful if we could go through a multi-day training session. Great question. Not something that we have done before, but we're always willing and up for it, and certainly something we could talk about. So, actually, I'll reach out offline to you, and person who put that question in, I know well. So we'll reach out offline and have that conversation. That's an interesting concept. We still have a few more minutes left. If you guys have a question, please, anything very specific, something you've seen in a gap analysis or remediation recommendation you have, we'd be happy to answer. Our time here is to bring value to you. So if you've got anything else, we'll just give it another minute to see if another question pops in. All right. Well, we don't have anything else. So hopefully we covered everything that was of interest, and you guys got some value out of this. You're very welcome. Someone just said thank you. And we're looking forward to kind of going on this journey with everyone. So on your way out the door here, I think there's like a follow-up poll that just asks if you'd like to be contacted for some help or for some more information. We'd love to do it and be a partner with you if that's something you're interested in, or just provide information. Always available to answer questions. Contact information is there. We will finish the recording and post it to everybody that attended today, so you'll be able to get on that. Thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful day.